When it comes to learning the deadlift, learning actually how to hinge properly at the hips is the key to a good, proper deadlift. And we also have to realize that the deadlift is much different than a squat. So a squat is primarily hips go down, hips come up, and there's a lot of bending in the knees to allow the hips to drop as low as possible. Whereas in the deadlift, the hips are pushing forward by hinging here at the hips, and then by pushing forward to stand right back up. So in order to learn how to hinge properly, we need to find where is that spot that you actually hinge from, where you actually bend and fold over. So one of the first things that you can do is just standing on the spot, lift one of your knees up, and with your hand, place where the crease is formed. Do the same thing with the other leg, find that crease, and where your hands are, this is where you're going to bend forward from. Once you found your crease, we want to make sure that when we are doing any hinging movement, that our spine remains neutral the entire time. So what I mean by that is when I'm standing tall here, in this bottom position, there is no change in my spinal position. It's tall here and straight, it's straight here. Neutral position, that's what we call it. We also want to make sure that the knees are soft, that they're not locked in place. So if I am trying to hinge forward and I am locking my knees in place, what ends up happening is I bend forward, but now a lot of my weight is forward, so I'm unbalanced. I'm going to be falling forward. I'm also limited as to how far I can actually lower down. So if I'm actually trying to get my hands closer to my feet, in order to compensate, I'd have to start rounding my back to do so. But if I'm holding on to weights and I got that rounded back, well, it's a recipe for disaster when you try standing right back up. So the knees do not stay locked. We want to think of them as soft. And if they're soft, that means they're going to bend slightly, and they bend just enough to allow my hips to push backwards. Because again, the deadlift or any hip hinging movement is about the hips pushing back and the hips pushing forward. So I keep my knees soft, I keep my spine neutral, and when I push back, the knees are still soft, they just bend enough to allow my hips to push in this direction. I will feel a slight stretch in the hamstrings there, which is perfectly fine, and this back remains neutral the entire time. When I stand up, I am not cranking through my lower back to stand. What I am doing is using my legs to push into the ground to stand right back up. So again, when I'm hinging, I'm going to fold forward at the hips. I'm going to allow the hips to push backwards, which also keeps me balanced. Another reason why to have the knees bent. If, again, as I mentioned earlier, if they're stiff and I try to hinge forward, I'm unbalanced, I'm going to fall forward. But if they're soft, the hips push back, the chest comes down, I'm better balanced. So I hinge at the hips, keep the knees soft, back is neutral, and as I stand, I push the ground away from me, and I have the knees push backwards and the hips push forward. So practice the hip hinge, practice it often. If you're going to use weights, start with light weights, but always keep in mind, we are hinging here at the hips, we are folding forward at the hips. Allow your chest to come down too. You don't have to keep it upright the entire time. Allow that chest to come down, hips are bent, knees are soft, and the back is neutral.